Well, good afternoon, and welcome to this next session, which I think is an incredibly important session. So my name is Mike Frank, and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer of Monsanto Company, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session, which is titled, Can Sustainable Food Production Scale? Which again is a topic that is near and dear to the heart of all of us that work at Monsanto and everyone that's involved in agriculture. So it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator today, which is Urvashi Rangan. Urvashi is the Director of Consumer Safety and Sustainability for Consumer Reports. She's also a scientist who has spent much of her career examining the safety and sustainability of our global food supply. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So good afternoon, everybody. We're excited to be here, and we're going to get right to it. We have about 45 minutes to chat with you about feeding 9 billion people. So that's, I don't know, 5 billion a minute or something like that. But we're going to get started. And I'm going to introduce our panelists and give you a little sort of highlight of what we're going to cover, and then we'll dive right in. So all the way at the end is Ricardo Salvatore. Ricardo is a senior scientist and director of the Food and Environment Program for the Union of Concerned Scientists. Next to him is Jason Smith, and Jason's from right here in Aspen, and he's the director of Rock Bottom Ranch. And to my right is Stephen Jones, who is a geneticist and a breeder and directs the Bread Lab, which I find fascinating, Stephen, developing lots of different wheat varieties and testing that all the way through in the kitchen to test for qualities and putting all of that into the distribution chain locally. And you know, the title of this session is Can Sustainable Production Scale? And can we, feed 9 billion people with that? The notion that scaling up is always a good thing, many of us often think of that as increasing yield, and such as, making more vegetables or fruits on a certain plant, or making a bigger and bigger farm on the same piece of land, or extending the shelf life of the final food product to infinity. And this panel is going to challenge that notion and really expand the thinking about how we can feed 9 billion people and add a little nuance and sophistication to the traditional notions we have of scale and how we achieve that goal in the best way possible. And really kind of talking and digging in on biodiversity, holistic farming, and can that really build capacity to feed 9 billion people? So Ricardo, the first question goes to you, which is, just on a basic level, where are we now in terms of how many we're feeding and calories we're producing, and how many do we need to get to calorie-wise to feed 9 billion people?
Okay, is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, so the answer to the last question is we don't need to increase any calorie production, zero. Now, that may be such a shocking statement giving the introduction here that you may even doubt that anyone who would say such a thing is qualified to talk to the topic, but let me explain to you the reason for that. So the rationale that Urvashi just detailed goes something like this. There is an estimate that by mid-century we will be 9 billion on the planet, currently a little over 7 billion. Currently, about 1 billion of us are hungry. So then the obvious conclusion is because hunger means lack of food, there must be insufficient food. Therefore, we need to produce more food. Therefore, this is used to argue that we need to push all-out production wherever we can. And there's a number of ramifications of all that logic. Well, let's go with that logic. Let's assume someplace in the future, if we pursue that logic, we are successful and we produce sufficient calories to feed the 9 billion. Can you imagine the headlines? World hunger ends. We have finally produced more food than necessary to feed everyone on the planet. Well, you can write that headline right now. So we currently produce sufficient calories to feed at least half again what the current population of the planet is. So clearly, the issue is not production. The issue is not even what usually follows that line every time that you hear it, that the problem is distribution. We actually need to parse what that means a little bit more carefully. as you all can attest, this very second, the food system is functioning just fine in Aspen, Colorado. You can have whatever you want, as much of it as you want, whenever you want to have it, whether it's in season or not, whether it's local to this place or not. And that's because all of us in this room are very economically powerful, which tells us that the problem for the 1 billion who don't enjoy that same privilege is that they are not very economically powerful. So if each one of you really wants to address the hunger issue, we need to address why people don't have sufficient economic power to be able to either produce for themselves or to engage with the food system so that then they can participate in the same benefits you're enjoying this moment. So to summarize, it's a little bit as if we said, my soup is getting cold, quick, turn up the fire. You go turn up the fire on the front burner, your soup is actually on the back burner. So what we need to discuss, if the question is how to feed the 9 billion, is to realize, first of all, the world needs to feed itself. It's a very patronizing argument and assumption to believe that some of us know how to do it and have the responsibility to do that for others on the planet. Secondly, we need to assure that those others have the access to the resources that they need in order to be able to produce for themselves. So there's much more that we can say throughout this hour to articulate this more fully, but this is the case that I'll make for you.
Great, thank you, Ricardo. Can I have the first slide up, please? Second slide, please. I have the clicker too, I'll advance the rest. So at Consumer Reports, and I'm sorry if some of you have seen this before, we run national survey polls often, so we can sort of get the pulse of what people are feeling in terms of their attitudes and behaviors, and we do a lot on food safety and food labeling. This is part of a food sustainability labeling survey that we did when we wanted to know what consumers value when they go out shopping, what means a lot to them. If this were an auto reliability survey, and we got a 75% response, your automobile is reliable, that's a really reliable automobile. So these are really overwhelming response rates and really a mandate from consumers for really more sustainable production practices, be it local, reducing pesticide exposure, supporting and willing to pay more for fair working conditions, protecting the environment. This is a real shift from what we've seen from caring about personal health to really caring about a variety of sustainability attributes. And this response, this was confirmed in December of 2015, but it really reflects what we've been seeing over the past few years. So with that and sort of keeping your eye on these different attributes, I want to ask our panel to describe the lens of your work and really to identify your top 3 impacts or goals or criteria for sustainable food production. Stephen, let's start with you.
Sure, and I just want to follow up on what Ricardo started with, and I agree. I couldn't agree more with that. I think another question I would have is why wait? Why wait for 9 billion? Why not start today, right? Feeding the people. I think that's an important one. And also this projecting to 2050 or whenever, it assumes we won't change either, right? That we'll waste the same, that our front lawns will be lawn instead of cabbage and potatoes if we were really hungry, right? So my grandparents came from Poland to Brooklyn. The first thing they did was tear out the parking strip and put in potatoes and cabbages. So that's how they dealt with their immediate hunger. So I think back to, is the slide still up or is it?
Put that up. Thanks.
Our strategy in the bread lab is we talk about food. We're agriculturalists, we're geneticists, we're breeders, but we always start with food, and we work on defining what we want our food to look like, what it should be, and it addresses every one of those issues right there. And if we decide what our food should be, do we want the workers treated fairly, the environment treated fairly, the animals treated humanely, everything involved in that, then food can pull agriculture in that direction. I think it's incredibly powerful. So I don't have 3 things, I would just have 1, and I think for us it's starting with the end point, which is food. And for plant breeders, that can be a unique situation to be in.
Thanks. Jason?
Yes, I work locally for the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies, and as an organization, kind of our four main goals include ecological literacy. We do a lot of forest health work. We're very involved in restoration work, and then fourth is sustainable agriculture, which I mainly focus on. Down at our Rock Bottom Ranch property, 22 miles from here, we're always looking at sustainable agriculture in regards to education of both making scalable, replicable models of both livestock and vegetable production, as well as consumer education about where our food comes from, how to prepare it, and how to complete the waste cycles. Additionally, we are looking at the integration between wildlife and domestic agriculture, and seeing how those two systems can not only coexist but enhance each other. And then finally, we're producing food. We're actually on the ground, growing and producing food for our community.
Great, thank you. Ricardo?
So there's a common thread here, basically a systemic perspective of the food system. So food, essential, but not the only thing associated with food. So at the Unit of Concerned Scientists, what we're aiming for is a good food system, and the good food system would provide simultaneously healthy food, and it's a sorrowful factor that we even have to specify that the output of the food system should be nourishing and wholesome for us, that if you consume it over the course of your lifetime, you don't find yourself paunchy, overweight, hypertense, and die prematurely from cardiac disease. So healthful food, item number one. That it should be produced sustainably, in other words, that we don't exploit nature. So healthy, green, should be fair. We don't exploit people either, and this is a huge factor. There are many things that we're condoning at this very moment about the food system in terms of human exploitation that we don't want to know about, yet without which the food system does not function. So healthy, green, fair, affordable. The end output of that should not be precious, available only to some of us. It should be a right for all of us. And as has been mentioned already, we should treat all sentient beings in the food chain humanely, specifically not only the people, but the animals that are involved in the system as well. So healthy, green, fair, affordable, humane food as a systemic perspective. Just one addendum to the observation that you made, Steve, which I think is really important for all of us to go away with in terms of the extrapolations about where we might be by mid-century, and us being so dense that we wouldn't change things when we realize that we're headed toward crisis. So one additional point about this, just because in this discussion, a very common refrain one hears is reference to a famous FAO study conducted by economists that estimated the demand for food in mid-century, that puts it that we will require so much more food that it justifies greater investments in all-out production technology. I won't dwell on that other than here's some facts about that study that need to be known. First of all, it's been revised downward. Secondly, the estimate was based on the assumption that all of us would want to eat like Americans. Now, the authors didn't write it that way, but when you look at their demand, the rationale was as we climb up the food chain in terms of being more wealthy, then we demand more meat and so on. So essentially the assumption is all of us will want to eat like Americans, and so therefore let's estimate the demand. And the demand is a dollar figure. It is the value of sales. It is an actual volume of production of food. So that stated, here's the important thing to clarify. Americans should not be eating like Americans, much less the rest of the world. We should not wish that fate on anybody else. And you know that this last week, actually the week past, China actually emitted a set of dietary guidelines that actually takes that into account. They're looking at the environmental load of the production system and pairing it with the health effects that they want to avoid for the future because of the estimated cost. And in that, they're far more advanced than the United States is at the moment. Because as you know, this very year, the United States had the choice to do the same thing with its dietary guidelines and denied that thinking about how we produce our food, if we're recommending a healthy food supply, is part and parcel of making the recommendation for what healthy food is to begin with.
Thank you. And I think on to this next slide, this is sort of just, a quick summary, and you can add to this. There's so many layers to it all, but I think one thing we all agree on up here is that intersection of the health and safety for the consumer, for the animals that we raise, for the people that are raising our food, and for the environment, they all intersect with one another. There's no end to to the connections we're making. I mean, just last week, CDC put out an alert about algae blooms from fertilizer use, and that is now a public health issue. And it illustrates the connections between what we're doing in the environment and farming and how that impacts all along the health of the production system. So I'm going to turn to the next question. And Ricardo, let's start with you. Is the answer to feeding, and I think we've sort of answered this, but is the answer to feeding the growing population simply scaling what we're already doing to produce more food?
Yeah, clearly not. Actually, that would be a recipe for disaster. Why would we want to replicate the way in which we currently intensively produce food at large scale elsewhere? We need to do this better in a way that doesn't exploit nature, doesn't exploit people, and produces healthful outcomes for everyone involved. That clearly does not describe the way in which large-scale industrial agriculture functions at the moment. I should be really clear that that's not necessarily the result of the intention of everyone involved in the food system, but is undeniably the result of the fact that we don't put a cost on environmental exploitation or human exploitation, and so we just follow the signals that exist in the economic system. So having cleared that, one thing that's abundantly important to understand about the food system is that the world pretty much does feed itself, or it doesn't at the moment. In other words, it is not the case that because there's vast surplus in one part of the planet, it can be shifted so that then it deals with unsatisfied demand in other parts of the planet. The food system is not a philanthropy, and so therefore the food system feeds those who can afford to actually buy its products. And so what this means is that what we choose to do with the surplus production that we have in the wealthy part of the world is to fatten our beef with it, to produce biofuels, to thicken our soups, to sweeten our soft drinks. Those are the ingredients of either the junk food diet or else they're essentially finding what in the Midwest is referred to, it's solving the problem of what to do with surplus production. It's not guided by dealing with hunger, even though that is the justification, the slogan that you hear a great deal. Pure motivation, but if you follow the way that the food system works, clearly people don't understand that the majority of the food that is produced on the planet is traded among wealthy countries to the extent that trade occurs. 10 to 20% of food that's produced is traded among the wealthy countries. So the important thing is for people in the places where they are producing their own food to have choices about the land that they should own, access to the water, the nutrients, the resources that they need in order to produce, rather than for that land to be part of the ecological footprint of those of us who are wealthy enough to command its products to flow to us, to the detriment of local production and local feeding of people.
And Stephen, you have a very interesting perspective in terms of centralized versus non-centralized food production. I think a lot of people think if you centralize it all, you can create bigger production more efficiently. You have another theory.
Sure. I think we should scale down instead of up. Might be a nice choice. And for us, we're really interested in a relatively small scale, but that region, our main region is Vancouver, British Columbia to Eugene, Oregon, let's say. So there's over 6 million people there. Our one of our main goals is to keep value where it's actually produced. So a simple way to look at that is we're not going to grow wheat, export that wheat, and then import flour because that value has been added in the flour process. Grow barley, export the barley, import malt. Make malt, export the malt, import beer. So you sort of get the notion of that. A really nice model there is buckwheat. So we grow buckwheat in Washington State. We grow buckwheat where we are, and I should mention that we're north of Seattle. So we're in the Skagit Valley. So we're basically out of place for any grain or any sort of crop that could be looked at as a commodity. We grow 80 crops in our valley, but basically none of them are commodities. So now we add wheat. But with buckwheat, the model for it was it would go to Japan at about $1 a pound. It would be cleaned and milled and come back as flour at $10 a pound. So we brought the miller from Tokyo. He's one of the top buckwheat millers in the world. And the first thing he said when he came into our lab was, "That's a really beautiful model." He said, "For me, it is." He said, "For you, it's a very stupid model." So he said, "I'm getting $9 out of this, and you're not getting anything, basically. You've exported all that value. So now we're putting a buckwheat mill in in our region, and Patagonia is helping make that happen. So infrastructure is lacking, but that needs to be built up. But it's basically, we deal as much with local economies as we do with local biologies, and it's keeping value where it's produced. It's not value added. The value's there. The value leaves in a centralized system and it goes to some place. But we want to keep it where it's produced, and it's quite a vigorous model once it gets going.
Thank you. Jason, can you talk to us a little bit about biodiversity? I think people think of that as a very environmental cause, and can you help us understand why that aspect is so important to the long-term sustainability of farming?
Yeah, absolutely. We're always looking at kind of simplifying, and being an environmental organization, we always look at the environment as an example. So our livestock operations really are modeled after really simple nature. We've got, if we looked at the really healthy soils in the Midwest at one point, we had really nice prairie land and grassland. There were really healthy topsoils. And that was created over hundreds and thousands of years by buffalo and bison would come, they'd eat the grass, they'd stomp, and they'd move on. In that system, the cowbirds would come behind. They would scratch through the manure looking for bugs and larvae and weed seeds, and they would clean and sanitize and distribute that manure, and then everyone kept moving, and that gave a lot of rest. So nature has identified three main things: diversity, lots of different animals; rotation is the physical movement of those animals; and then rest is that time period to recover. So our livestock and agriculture operations at the ranch really reflect on that. We lead with cattle and sheep, our version of buffalo or bison. Then we follow in with sometimes pigs, and we always follow with chickens, either laying hens or meat chickens. And so all of those animals are providing a service while really efficiently using the land. So we're always looking at efficiency. So instead of just having just one crop, say beef, come off of our property, we are now stacking enterprises, and we're adding different revenue streams off that same land. We're improving the soil health. We are also decreasing our pests and diseases, and just producing more food off of a smaller piece of land.
Thank you. And I think it is interesting to tie these notions to, resilience of our system. And ultimately, that's what we've got to achieve in a changing climate, in drought conditions. We need crops that are resilient, and they need other crops and other organisms, and they need healthy soil in order to do that. And I know this isn't a conversation about water, but when the soil's really healthy, it actually holds the water better, and it's actually very tied into water conservation. And there probably haven't been enough big studies done looking at that, but we're finally beginning to really understand the impact of good soil. It's where the nutrition is, the nutrients are, the pest control, the disease control, as well as the water conservation aspects on a farm. I'm going to also add my 2 cents to this, which is at Consumer Reports, we're often trying to tether the notion of safety of the final product to sustainable production practices. And I am going to advance this slide and talk a little bit about our ground beef study for 2 minutes. And what we try to do, we educate people on labels and where the value is, where the value isn't in a label like natural, which doesn't have to mean anything, and really trying to drive demand towards more sustainable production practices. But one thing we also want to do is really help bring the bottom up in some ways too. And we work a lot on trying to get better pathogen standards in place, getting antibiotics out of daily use in agriculture. In our ground beef story that we did last year, we looked at conventional ground beef packages and compared those to those that were more sustainably produced. By that I mean they were produced without daily antibiotics, or they were organic, or they were grass-fed, or they were all three. And these comparisons show you looking at Staphylococcus aureus. So staph is not something normally on the farm, but really a result of handling. But you've heard of MRSA, and that is the resistant Staphylococcus. Big difference in the conventional ground beef versus the more sustainably produced. C. perfringens, this is a Clostridium. It actually is tied to 1 million illnesses annually from ground beef. It's not something our government's tracking or looking at, except for the CDC, who knows that the diseases are are coming out, but it's something we need to dig into more, obviously, across the system. Salmonella, we expect it to be low. It's not a high prevalence in beef, although 2% with millions of pounds of beef produced is actually a lot of contaminated beef on the market. But the other particularly striking result was the E. coli. And as we know, E. coli and pathogenic E. coli can be very problematic in beef. 300 samples, not enough to detect the pathogenic strains. Those run at about 0.5% prevalence, and yet they still lead to a lot of illnesses and some deaths every year. So we looked at general E. coli as a proxy, and you can see, again, big difference between conventionally produced ground beef and more sustainably produced. I won't get into some of the science behind that, but there is some science behind that in terms of animals eating a more natural diet. Grass-fed, for example, being on pasture allows their guts to operate at a different pH level. And when they're corn-fed all the time, their pH levels, I believe, actually become more acidic, which is more conducive for E. coli and for shedding out of the gut. The last thing I just want to show you is the percent of these bacteria that will multi-drug resistant. So these are superbugs. These are the things that are resistant to 3 or more antibiotic classes. Antibiotic class is important in treating us in human illnesses. You can see, again, there are big differences in conventional versus more sustainably produced, about half the rate in the bacteria being multi-drug resistant. When you look at the grass-fed, that's pulled out of the more sustainably produced column. In the second, you see it's 3 times lower in terms of the bacteria that are multi-drug resistant. So really documenting why producing things more sustainably has an impact on the health of even the final product, when we know we've heard from Stephen and Jason talking about the health of the farming system as well. Okay, and we can go back to video. Thank you. We're done with the slides. Okay, on to the next question, and then we'll open it up to you all too. Organic production is the largest growing agricultural segment of the market. It's growing. It's about 4% of the agricultural market, but it's almost growing in double digits every year. Consumer demand now exceeds the U.S. domestic organic supply, and my question is about organic, but about sustainable production practices. Is this something that we should be scaling on our domestic market? And again, I think we've sort of answered this, but Jason, could you just start us off, again, sort of thinking about, we have a demand, should we start meeting that with the supply?
Absolutely, and we're big proponents of increasing sustainable production. I just want to redefine that. Organic doesn't necessarily mean sustainable all the time, so we need to really define that and look at that. A strawberry that's produced organically and certified organic in Chile may have a really different impact than a non-certified organic strawberry that's grown right down the road. So I think we need to look at that and identify that first, and then it always comes back to production and efficiency. We want to see these really good systems evolve, and hopefully we can look at some of these sustainable practices becoming a bigger segment of the market in several different ways. Which I think we were going to talk about, but lots of different.
Great. Ricardo, are there any scientific studies along these lines about scaling sustainable food productions, and any other perspective that you have?
Yeah, there's plenty of attention to this. In the interest of time, let me summarize what I think are really important facts about the exchange of not only organic, but fruits and vegetables in general, actual food as opposed to processed food, that should inform this conversation. Much contrary to the conceit of those of us that are involved in agriculture in the United States, what we export to the rest of the world as a major agricultural power tends to be the ingredients, as I've said, for the junk food diet. Think of the major commodity exports from the United States. Now, we do export about $7 billion worth of fruits and vegetables a year. Problem is that we actually import $11 billion more than that in fruits and vegetables. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. But one of the things that it tells you is that in terms of actual food, fruits and vegetables as opposed to commodities that are being exported, the world feeds us. this is an important mind bender for most Americans. And one proxy for this is that 80% of the world's organic certified farmers are outside of the United States. A country like India is one of the major producers meeting the demand in the United States for organic food. So it's important to be aware of these factors that we normally don't think of in terms of the agricultural prowess of the United States, because it means we really could produce a whole lot more to not only meet our internal demand, but to provide greater economic opportunity for farmers that can produce the fruits and vegetables that can be produced domestically. Now, there's certain fruits and vegetables that will never produce domestically. So the bananas, the coffee, these sorts of things can't be produced domestically. But when you factor just what we can produce domestically, we can do a whole lot better than we can. So going to some of the studies, we've done an analysis at the Union of Concerned Scientists that you can find on our website, which is called Plant to Plate. So the premise is the following. You shouldn't be paying attention necessarily just to say, foodies, this isn't what I'm telling you. Let's go to authorities to pronounce on what we actually ought to be eating, and then say, what if our public investment, so federal dollars going to support the food system, supported what the government itself tells us that we ought to be eating? So follow that premise. So if you do that, then the government recommends that our plate should be 3/4 plant-based. So if we actually ask the question, can we do that within the United States? For the domestically producible fruits and vegetables in the United States, here's what it would require. Context. We currently have 334 million arable acres in the United States. We currently produce fruits and vegetables on 10 million of those, less than 2%. In order to meet the demand for fruits and vegetables that we can produce domestically, to meet the US dietary guidelines, we would need to increase fruit and vegetable land by only 13 million acres. It's easily done. A sliver of the Midwest could do that, which is not in the interest of California farmers, by the way, who like the status quo as it is right now for that very reason. But if we just keep our attention at that high-level question, here's some of the consequences of that per our analysis. So first of all, think about the jobs that are created for the farmers and the distribution chain as a result of producing more fruits and vegetables on just 13 million additional acres. And we're talking here food, stuff that we're not going to be turning into junk food. So per our calculation, that means 189,000 additional jobs. And it also means an economic benefit of $11.5 billion that would go directly to farmers and those in the supply chain to markets and other ways of distributing that food. And you have to be fair. There are winners and losers. This is an economic analysis when you're producing more of these fruits and vegetables domestically. The bottom line, you'll be able to see this in the report, but the bottom line of this is that it would cost the government support to provide the technical assistance, provide the insurance, cover those farmers that would be producing the additional fruits and vegetables per the scenario that I've just described. And by our estimate, that would be $90 million of additional investment to get that $11 billion of economic multiplier that I described. Now, for context, nominally in our Farm Bill, we support the commodity system to the tune of about $5 billion a year. Nominally, because the fact is it can grow as big as it has to. In the past year, it was $11.5 billion. So much more efficient use of federal resources to meet the supply or the demand for food domestically to the benefit of U.S. farmers and ranchers. So take a look at that report if you're interested in studies that actually look at a better way of producing food.
Jason, do you want to
Ricardo,
add?
I'd love to add to that. There's currently 40 million acres of lawn in the United States, which is a pretty staggering amount of land. So land issues usually come up first as the major hurdle for access to people growing food. And just as a quick example, my sister lives in North Carolina. They have a small front yard, and they tilled it up a couple years ago and started growing food on it. It was about 1/8 of an acre, about 5,000 square feet. And kind of as a hobby after work, her and her husband have kind of normal jobs, and they would grow food after work, and then on Saturdays they'd go to a farmer's market. And so this little piece of land produced enough food. They went to market, and she sold a couple $100s worth of food a week. And I said, really, why are you doing this? Why are you wasting your time with this? It's such a little amount of money. And she said, that little piece of land pays our mortgage for the entire year, in addition to providing us really healthy food. So we have great food, and we're offsetting our mortgage and using the land way more efficiently than just lawn.
It's great. It's real empowerment. Stephen, did you have anything to add before we go on to the last question?
No, I think those were beautiful.
Okay, great. All right, so I want to turn a little bit to efficiency of the food system, and we've talked a little bit about that. Can you each identify an important variable anywhere along the way from soil to sale on the production line that could significantly increase the efficiency of our production system? If we solve some of these efficiency issues, how much food could be recovered today that doesn't currently make it to market, and what are the barriers of making this happen? Stephen, you want to start?
Yeah, I think I'll go contrary on that too, and I think we're too efficient. And if you talk about par baking bread in LA so it can be served around the country and baked off, what does that mean? Again, if we say, what do we want in our food? Do we want dough conditioners? Do we want all kinds of crap in there so that food can sit on a semi for 2 weeks? I think we're too efficient.
Okay, thanks. That's a great perspective on too efficient.
If I'm defining efficient correctly.
Yeah,
so.
well, I guess you could see it that way. But Jason, Ricardo, can you offer some perspective and maybe some on the other side as well? Are there efficiencies to be had, Jason?
Absolutely, and again, looking at efficiencies and stacking on the lands. I drove a beautiful ride in this morning over McLean Flats, and I saw acres of pasture that's devoted to horse or hay production. So some of these other enterprises can stack to that really well. You can plug in a laying hen operation behind cattle or horses really, really, really well, and it would benefit the land, it would benefit the soil, it would benefit it add another revenue stream, as well as providing for our local community. So we look at some efficiencies there, and then the other big point that we have hit on during this whole Ideas Fest is we've spent a lot of time looking at food waste. The opening reception, we had several items that we assisted with to provide food out of food ingredients that would have otherwise gone to the landfill or the compost bin. And we again, produce a lot of food, and if we can just utilize it better or be aware of the waste that we're creating, it would be better for everybody.
Ricardo?
So I won't gild the lily on these 2 points, which I think are really important, but I'll speak to you as an agronomist and talk to you about where I think the greatest inefficiency in the system is, which is at the very beginning in production. Again, contrary to what I think a lot of us assume about the system, the footprint of the good food system, the system that we've been describing here, and which would provide, 3/4 of our plate, fruits and vegetables, the footprint of that system is much smaller than the footprint of the system that we have right now. The prospect that we have ahead of us is producing less, better, for the benefit of everyone. Now, that may seem so counterintuitive that I actually have to explain what I mean by that. So what we work on at the Union of Concerned Scientists is a system of production which is referred to as agroecology, which is the body of science and practical knowledge that farmers have generated to achieve the greatest efficiencies in terms of agricultural production. And so if I could summarize it as briefly as possible, it is finding the ways in which natural mechanisms are already working for us, and we basically just need to intercept the way in which ecology is already providing the conversion of sunlight into nourishing food. And this can be done by taking advantage of all kinds of efficiencies. I'll just mention one so that you can appreciate the example, and there are many others. Large extensions of wheat, potato, corn, sunflower, all the large commodity crops that you can imagine, which we normally see as a triumph of industrialization and mechanization and efficiency, are one of the dumbest ways in which we could produce. And let me give you the example, again, as an agronomist. They're one of the dumbest ways to use the single most important resource on which agriculture is driven, and thereby, by extension, the rest of the planet, all of us living beings, and it is sunlight. So agriculture as a whole is a very poor converter of that sunlight. We're very happy when about 5% of solar energy that falls on a full canopy actually gets converted into dry matter that we can harvest. But here's the key thing. The moment that sunlight is intercepted at the top of the canopy, it actually begins to be filtered. the quality of that sunlight shifts as you get deeper into the canopy. And in a monoculture, we don't take advantage of the fact that that light at a different wavelength is actually still useful, even though it's not as strong. The flux is not as dense. And so polycultural farmers from the beginning of agriculture have known that and have actually established and managed intentionally different layers of the canopy so that you can take advantage of at least 3 different layers above the ground. And given that 50% of plant mass and crop production is below the ground, intentionally managing what happens below the ground as well. So if you can imagine what I'm describing, you will immediately see that for such a system to work well, where you have, in other words, lots of species growing on the same area of land, they need to be complementary to each other. They shouldn't be trying to occupy the same ecological niche, or in other words, competing with each other. So the art is in finding the right mixes. And we have about 10,000 years of experience in finding the right combinations of species that actually do that thing, both in the aerial environment as well as in the subterranean environment. In the very best cases, the complementarity is such that you can produce 6 times as much, so 6 times as much on an area of land than if you took 6 different unit areas of land for a monoculture of each one of those crops. So you talk about efficiency. Polycultural agroecological systems actually allow us to provide more food, more solar energy conversion than the current monocrop system. So I'm not alarmed, by the Chicken Little stories about how the sky is falling and we need to learn how to produce more and we're running out of land and we need to be efficient and find land-saving methods, because we actually know how to do this. The trick is, will we wait for crisis in order to implement knowledge that we already have, or will we actually do, as Stephen has said, act on what we know?
And I want to I agree with both of those completely. I want to just expand on my early comment on efficiency. And we recoil from that term quite often because one definition of efficiency is faster, cheaper.
Absolutely.
And that's just burning the farmers, right? Just burning them way down. So.
And I think we talked a little about shelf life and just touched on it, but do we need our foods filled with additives to make sure that they can stay on the shelf forever? I think that's another big question, and it's a whole nother panel discussion. But at this point, we've got about 15 minutes for questions, so we're happy to take them. I think we've got some folks up at the front here. Or, you know what? I'm sorry, you are right there next to the microphone. Why don't we take the first question from you?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, and could you please say your name? And
My name is Ann Lipton. I'm actually a small family farmer in St. Louis, or in Augusta, Missouri, and I grow for a restaurant that's also mine in St. Louis. And I wrote a few things down because I'm nervous. So I grow using organic and biodynamic practices. And this is a comment. The Midwest is an extraordinary growing climate. And I rotate. I have 300 acres, and about 50 of them are actively used with. I have a herd of Angus, and then there's meat goats that are used to clear the shrub. We are vegetable and fruit growers, so we are very biodiverse, and it works beautifully. We're on well water. The soil is rich, and we are not burdened with the droughts. My challenge is it's labor. The schools are still teaching big ag, basically, that wheat, corn, and soy farmers how to do it in huge monocultures. And I can create good jobs, but my farm managers come from outside of DC. The last one came from the West. The education is not supporting what I try to do.
Does anyone want to comment on that? Stephen?
I would agree with that, and I think you demand more. If these are public universities, you make that very clear, your concerns. I agree with it.
Ricardo?
And I always
Jason?
look
Yeah.
back, education is our number one goal as an organization, and we certainly don't apologize for the labor that we incur. We are creating jobs. We bring people onto the farm. We've had people that have come and learned how to farm on our property. They've gone and started their own farms. So we encourage that and we want that. And I certainly agree that the support system isn't quite there, but we just need to speak up and demand that. And the biggest aspect of sustainability, and one of the important aspects of sustainability is the social component. And if we create good jobs that pay fair wages, that have good working conditions, it's going to attract this new generation of farmers. And I can say in just my short 10 or 12 years of working in food, I've seen that shift dramatically, especially in the last 3 or 4 years. There's young people that are interested in farming, and just connecting those dots is really where we're working on the next couple of years.
In my lab too, I can elaborate a bit. So I have 3 PhD students. All of them work on farm with farmers. One biodynamic, the other's organic. So they're there.
So in thinking how to scale that, Ricardo, do you have any intelligence on land-grant universities, what they're teaching, and why they're teaching it, and maybe where the real focus needs to be to get that kind of broad change across universities to maybe shift the way they're thinking about how they're teaching?
Yeah, so I did spend almost 30 years working within the land grant system, so I do have some observations, but I first of all want to make something clear. I don't want for a misinterpretation to emerge from this discussion that you triggered with your comments, and then I want to come back and actually suggest something very concrete that you can do. So speaking just for myself, the misinterpretation I want to avoid is that what we're saying is that scale in and of itself is undesirable or negative. As long as the majority of us are not going to be producing our food, there is a place for scale, and there are places on the planet, including where you are, where there's relative homogeneity, particularly on the east-west axis, which is really important, for large scale. What I am saying is that where large scale can be done, that there are much smarter ways of doing large scale. And in fact, there's great opportunities for the private sector in that area. They're just not pursuing those opportunities. So clarifying that, that there is a place for large scale, and then talking about the issues that you're facing. Imagine any enterprise that you paid for public dollars that by definition is to serve the public, to serve you. And the first thing that they said was, we're going to help you, but we don't have anything for 90% of you. We're going to do something for 10% of you. Now, nobody actually intended that, but the history of the land grant system since the 1860s essentially meant that. They generated the technologies that displaced almost every farmer in this nation. Now, it's important to clarify when I say nobody intended that. They were trying to eliminate drudgery, and they were addressing a lot of very serious problems in agriculture of the late 19th century. The problem was that this was led by technologists. So if it had been led by social scientists or people who asked this question, what can we do that is better for the farming population, rather than how can I use my agricultural engineering to figure out how I can make a machine and not think about the consequences of what introducing this machine, its greater cost, the scale that would be required for it to be viable, and so on. Not thinking about the complexities, but just the linear technological question. That's the sickness of the land grant system. And so what you can do to reverse that, and it will take all of us, is actually trying to reverse almost 150 years of bad behavior on the part of technologists who find a safe home at the land grant university system. So they will use the slogans that we've been countering here for the last hour, and the lack of careful thinking along the lines of what we're recommending that people really understand about the way that the food system actually works is what allows them to continue to operate in this way. And they have common interests. This is not a conspiracy theory. It just happens that they have common interests that work with the private sector. Many of us coming out of the land grant system go into the private sector, so that's where we're catechized. So we don't know how to think any differently than that. And so the key thing that can be done is to realize the decisions that actually create the cement that stabilize the way that the food system works right now are spread out over many different places, but one of the places is every time that there is a farm bill and we get to write the rules about how we're going to invest public resources to support the agricultural system. And right now, in spite of what you might read in civic books, it really is about 5 people sitting in a room with the chairs of 2 committees that essentially say, keep this, take that out, add $5 billion here, take it out of here. I'm only exaggerating a little bit. That's essentially the way that the system works. The rest of us really don't matter because we're not paying attention. We don't realize that that's what's going on. I think a little bit of energy that says, these 5 people, they should have a voice. It's not like their voice doesn't matter. It's that the rest of us have something to say. We also have an interest, and there are alternatives. It's not like this is the only way that we can nourish this country, save nature for the future, so that we can actually do the best thing that we know how to do, rather than fall on the default to say that whatever worked for the 19th century, we have to force to work in the 21st century. So there's obviously much more to say about this. About 2 weeks ago, I did an interview for the California Food Observer where I say a whole lot more about the land-grant system. If you're curious, go have a look at that. But the key thing is, as Steve has said, we need to demand more of that system, but you need to follow the money. Their money comes from federal budgets, although it's diminishing from that source, and they really need to hear from you as well about different ways of using that money.
Yeah, and I want to pull it back just a pinch. So we need to demand more of our public universities, no doubt. Our university, Washington State, we have an undergrad major in organic production. We have a small farms program. All of my students have a rural sociologist on their committees. So there's variation across the country. There's variation within an institution. So they're what we have, and we should increase that dialogue and be innovative how we can do both, right? We're not demonizing any end of the scale whatsoever, but we can add, and if we add, that's where the power is. So that's how we look at it.
Can I just make one more very quick comment?
Yeah, really quick, and so we can get some other questions in from folks.
Water and soil. We also have a generation of kids that can't afford college, but they're agrarian based because of their parents. If somehow it was integrated into the high school system as well, it would avoid them working at fast food and just continuing what is going on here. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for your comment. Okay, yeah, let's take the next question back there.
I think our sponsor's hair might be on fire at the moment, but how do we convince how do we get to the multinational industrial farming enterprises to get behind what we're talking about here today? Obviously, Monsanto is one of the biggest companies in the world, and they tend to promote more in the form of the major industrial farm. So how do we get that company and the other ones to buy into what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, for me, I don't think anyone's hair should be on fire. What we offer are options and alternatives. So we're not antagonistic towards systems. They're big, beautiful systems in place. If there's nowhere for other people to go that don't want to be into that system, that's an issue. So we offer alternatives and options regionally, keeping value where it's produced. We're not antagonistic. And I don't think anyone's hair should be on fire.
How do we get those enterprises to buy into what
I think that's up to them again. So for us, we offer an option that's parallel. So we're not gonna fix anything in a big commodity system. I work in wheat. There's 55 million acres of it. I work with about 30,000. It's one option.
Let's take another question up here in the front. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, sir.
I wanted to get your reaction to wheat production. If we are more efficiently producing wheat, but we're increasing the risk of diabetes and obesity by raising the glycemic index of the wheat, what are we truly accomplishing, and how are we going in that direction as far as the tremendous problem we're dealing with health-wise?
Sure. So my lab works with 100% whole wheat. So that's the first step, is we don't do white flour or anything. So that's the first step. We work with regionally produced wheat, low input, that's our strategy, is to produce good food.
And just to be clear, Stephen, with the protein and the germ on it, you actually reduce the glycemic value, and so it's not white bread, literally.
Yeah, when you take away a kernel of wheat is one of the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. White flour is one of the least. We enrich it because if that's all we ate, we'd get berry, okay? That's the extremity of that. We don't deal with white flour.
Jerry?
Hi, Jerry Hagstrom. I'm a journalist in Washington. I'd like to ask Ricardo about his ideas about expanding fruit and vegetable production. It seems to me a lot of the imported fruits and vegetables are off-season. The nutritionists constantly say eat fresh fruits and vegetables, not canned. What do you think about that? And of these 189,000 jobs, a lot of them would have to be farm workers, and the people in California and the rest say it's already very difficult because of the immigration problems. How would you deal with that? And what do you think about importing produce from Mexico right across the border? Would you draw the line at the U.S. border?
Simple questions. Okay, so let me see if I can remember them in sequence. So we possibly are talking to different nutritionists. Frozen canned fruits and vegetables, preserve their nutritional quality. They are acceptable as part of a healthy diet. So I don't see that there's any scientific reason to be careful there. Now, there's other factors to consider, but just because that's the question that you asked, the act of freezing or canning them, that's actually... Oh, so that's a processing issue. What Jerry mentioned was additional salt. So, so if you absent that, canning, flash freezing, all of these technologies are actually a boon to the food system in terms of preserving what's produced in one part or in one season for another. Okay, now the next thing, the California fruit and vegetable producers and labor. So in the systemic view of healthy, green, fair, and affordable, humane of the good food system that I proposed, the reason why you have to talk about this as a system is that the very people who enable the system to function, who pick the fruits and vegetables, clean them, process them, deliver them, in many cases serve them. Here at Aspen, you notice they clean up our mess after we get done. So this whole sector of people are some of the very people who can't afford the food system that they enable. The trick here, when you look at the entire value chain, is not to try to squeeze the production chain, paying everybody as little as possible, because then we create the problem that I've just described. Insufficient income, it's not lack of food, it's insufficient income to access the food. So we should not be proud and should stop saying as if we're proud that we have the cheapest food system in the planet, because that just means we learn how to exploit the entire value chain. For people that live with the luxuries that we live with in this country in particular, we should not be proud that we pay as little as possible to labor. So there needs to be more money in the system so that then companies and then farmers all can pay more to the people that are doing the labor, without which the rest of us don't eat. So that's a very important factor. Now, California farmers realize that. So California farmers, because they're on the front lines of this, don't line up with, say, fellow members of the Farm Bureau across the rest of the country with very divergent views about what we should do about progressive immigration policies. If we believe in a market system, the market should be open to both products, so that answers the last question that you asked, fruits and vegetables. If there's comparative advantage for that in Mexico, then farmers here should live by the same logic that they apply to we should export to corn to the rest of the world and accept that Mexico has comparative advantage for that. And the North American Free Trade Agreement has provisions that are supposed to ward against the concerns that most of us would have around safety, regulation, and so on and so forth. So the labor issue comes into this because we currently put up barriers so that labor can also flow to where there is demand. But by market principles, if we have a trading block, labor should also be able to flow to where there is demand. But for a number of different reasons, we actually don't do that. Meaning, de facto, we don't really believe in the market system and we intervene. So there's much more to say, but you asked complicated questions. That's my summary.
I think I'm getting the 0 minute. I'm sorry. So if you have any other questions, maybe you can come up and chat with our panelists, and let's have an applause for our panel. Thank you so much.